Get started. Jasmine, anything administrative need to be done before we actually officially kick off the meeting?
No, we're all set.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I got an email from our colleague, Deborah Dix Maxwell, this morning, reminding us that it was 65 years ago today that Emmett Till was killed, and 55 years ago today that the March on Washington occurred. And the work that we do sadly remains relevant, and it just underscores the importance of everything that we have to get done in the coming weeks and months. And so I want to thank her for reminding us of the significance of this day, but also just underscoring the importance of the work. And we'll get into the approving the minutes, but before so, I want to hand it off to Anita to see if she wants to say an initial word of greeting before we get into our co-chair comments.
No, I'm fine. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Okay, with that, would like to review if anyone has any questions about the minutes or approve the minutes, and would welcome a motion to that effect.
So moved, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. Second?
Second.
Thank you, Henderson. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, great. Thank you. Justice Earls, hand it off to you for some preliminary comments before we get into the reports.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Attorney General Stein. I just wanted to kind of summarize a little bit where we've been since the last time we were together as a full task force. And in particular, I wanted to highlight, because I know not everyone could be at every session, the fact that we have had substantial public input since the last full task force meeting. So we had a public hearing at which there were a wide range of citizens. We ended up having the full 3 hours complete, and we did keep everyone to 2 minutes. I think we were all impressed by how much content people actually can get across to us in 2 minutes, and the wide range of citizens from across the state who participated and raised concerns, had suggestions and ideas. We heard from victims who emphasized the importance of not forgetting what the goal in the sense of which the criminal justice system is intended to redress harm and wrongs. We heard about issues that aren't necessarily on our list in that public hearing, about corrections facilities and what's going on in our prisons. But then in addition to that, we had 6 listening sessions, which were an opportunity to hear both from local leaders, so city council members, local district attorneys, public defenders, legislators, but also community members, and a chance to have a little bit more of a dialogue, interaction back and forth. Those listening sessions are summarized in a 15-page document. So if you don't have an opportunity to watch all of them, because the recordings are also available, there is a summary on the SharePoint site that goes through the kinds of things that we heard at the listening sessions. I would say one consistent theme across the state was about training, and not that training was a be-all, end-all solution, but everyone talked about training for law enforcement, training for court personnel, training for everyone involved in the system. We heard about police civilian review boards from a number of different places that have them, suggestions for how to make them more effective, ways in which they're not yet achieving their goal. We heard about restorative justice practices from a couple of different listening sessions. And we certainly heard a lot about issues that are already on our agenda. So the impact of fines and fees, the impact of money bail. We heard about from a couple of different places, that district attorney's offices need more data about charges so that they can better monitor what is happening in their offices. And we heard about the impact that the death penalty has on racial equity throughout the criminal justice system and calls to end the death penalty. And I'm just really like briefly giving an overview. Obviously, I can't begin to summarize everything that we heard, but I just wanted to emphasize the wide range of things that we heard. And in some instances, we heard things that hadn't come up yet. So in Asheville, from a reentry specialist, the impact of drug convictions barring SNAP benefits and the fact that more women are being convicted, and the way in which that bar really makes reentry so much harder. So a lot for us to consider. And then in addition to that, we have written submissions. When I looked at the spreadsheet, it appeared to me we have over 200 written submissions, and they vary widely, both in terms of what they're asking us to address. Some are attaching research and law. So we have legal scholars and social scientists submitting their work to us. Some are reflections on our work so far. So there was a comment about one of our listening sessions not adequately providing for community input. And again, a lot of suggestions and ideas for us. So I urge you to consider taking some time to review those written submissions, but I also just wanted to make clear that we are getting huge public interest in the work of this commission, and people are taking their time to give us their best input, and we are hearing it. So that, I think that was important to note. I just want to say that we know that these issues remain timely. It seems important to me that as an overarching matter, we remember that this is a racial equity task force, that the risk is that we will see ourselves as a criminal justice task force. And I hope you understand what I mean about the distinction between that. We are a racial equity task force, and we can look at what happened historically, but we can look at what's happening right now today in our communities. We know that Raleigh is again under a curfew this evening. We know that unprecedented things are happening nationally with the NBA suspending the finals because of the need to address these issues. So I want to say to each of you that I know this work has been burdensome. I know it's been time consuming, but you are the leaders that our governor has chosen to address these issues for our state. And it is so crucial that you continue to give us your best effort, your best instincts, your best knowledge, your best spirit, and to continue to participate the way you have, bringing your best to the table, because it's only together that we can address these issues, and we've just come too far to give up now. So I want to thank you for your time and your commitment, but just urge you to hang in there with us. And along those lines, I want to correct a misstatement that I've made in the past. I've said, well, after December, then we have a year and a half to implement these recommendations. When I went back and looked at the executive order, it actually says that it stays in effect till December 31st, 2022. So just wanted to clear the record on that. That's how long, barring any other action by a governor, that's how long this task force is around to do this work. But as an overarching point, because it doesn't really fit into any issue area necessarily, I hope that we will think about whether or not a more permanent structure to carry on this work is required, what that would look like, who should be involved in it, what their mission would be, that some thinking along those lines and an ultimate recommendation is something that I would ask us to consider. And finally, I want to just say to take notice that because our next meeting is not until October, there will be a lot of recommendations, I think, by that point. And this meeting is just an exciting opportunity to hear from all the work groups on what they're working on. But I really ask you to listen carefully, because if there's an issue or a potential recommendation from another work group that you have questions about, that you want more data on, that you have input you want to give on, I would say to be proactive and to start looking at those concerns, talking with the chair of that other work group, or maybe watching some of their meetings because they're online. But my point is that there will be a lot on our agenda in October. I just think it's inevitable. And so we need to be doing a lot of work between now and then, even potentially on some of the issues, if they are of interest to you, that come up in other work groups. So this is an opportunity to sort of be on notice about what else is being considered, because you'll be asked to vote on those other things in some fashion in October. So with that, I will turn it over to Attorney General Stein to give you a few more details about some of the process that we're going to follow.
Thanks, Nita. And yeah, thanks for just underscoring the continued importance. I mean, the shooting of Jacob Blake hit everybody extremely hard. And it just, these are unbelievably difficult, ingrained issues. We can't snap our fingers to make it go away, but what we can do is identify a series of changes that need to be made so that these incidents don't happen, or certainly are dramatically reduced. We have been, Anita and I have been very excited because we get to observe each of your work groups and we know how much progress each of you are making. And what I'm excited about this meeting is for you to hear about what's going on with your colleague work groups. And so we're going to get to that right away. But in the process of our sitting through this, a few things have come up kind of procedurally that we think can help us be more efficient and effective going forward. Those include, we're going to have a format where a template, when you all, as a work group, get your recommendations kind of vetted through, you've identified the scope of the problem, you've identified why it's an issue, you've identified a potential solution, and you have the evidence to show how that solution can help solve the problem that we're wanting to address. We're going to create a template, and Ellen and team will get that out to you soon after today's meeting. And I think it'll help you all structure your work going forward. Part of that is going to be a piece on implementation, because that's an important part of the executive order. It's not only to, the governor said he wants us to identify and implement changes. And so that's something we want you to think through. In addition to identifying a recommendation, it's like, okay, well, now how do we put that into effect? When different work groups have used different strategies to try to hone in on their priorities and consensus. Some have used surveys. So these are ways to gain insight, get feedback. Feel free to pursue that as a strategy. Again, all the staff who's working with you on the work group and on the task force can help move that forward. And this is an important thing for every single person on this task force, because we want you to make sure that you feel as though your ideas, your input are being heard. And to the extent you feel like in your work group it's not happening, then please share it with just Searles, me, any of the staff folks along the way. And if it's not that, but you're really needing to hear from some person or some stakeholder group, and you don't feel like the working group has benefited from that, let us know what you need in order to maximize the value of your participation to this collective work effort. So those are the preliminary words. And now for the main event, we're excited to hear folks to report. Most of them are just going to be reporting, the work groups, on things that they've really been advanced but not quite ready to bring as a full recommendation to the task force. There are going to be two specific recommendations for the task force consideration from work group 3, and we will get to that in due time. And now I will hand it off to Karen and Michael. Thank you. Karen, still on mute. You're still on mute.
Thank you. All righty then. All right. Thank you, Attorney General Stein and Justice Earls, for your comments this morning, and good morning to everyone. So we are, as Attorney General said, this is the main event, and we're really excited about the reports that we're about to hear. So without further ado or further ado, we are going to go ahead and start with our working group number 1. And so would like to hear from both Mayor Colvin and I think Leslie. Excuse me.
So good morning. Thank you so much. And good morning, co-chairs, Attorney General and Justice Earls and everyone else. So as Leslie is bringing the screen up, I would like to first say thank you for giving me such a professional group to work with Chief Davis, Representative Galliard, and Sheriff Ingram. So certainly have a wealth of experience, and the support of Leslie and Angela has been wonderful. With this first work group, we, under law enforcement management, the first thing we wanted to do was to make sure that our group identified the areas that were important to them. And so the areas of responsibility as they agreed upon those were recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce, also law enforcement training to promote public safety and build support and law enforcement accountability. And the way that we had agreed to do it, that we would lay out our calendar, our projected schedule, that we would utilize those meetings to drill down and get specific conversations, have very in-depth conversations with presenters and with each other. And then we would move to the next one. And so in the meantime, we would also try to identify any low-hanging areas that we can get quick consensus and send that recommendation back to the overall group. And so the first area of responsibility that we dealt with was the recruiting and retaining a diverse and racially equitable workforce. In light of today's events, we know that it couldn't be more important that you have members of our workforce in law enforcement that, one, are not only look like the communities that they're asked to protect, but also to have an understanding about the people that they're encountering. And so unfortunately, we see at times that there are two different paths that law enforcement can take. One, as we looked at the very tragic events of the young man in Wisconsin, we saw that here's an unarmed man trying to flee from police for whatever reason. He's walking away, no weapon. It's assumed he may have something in his car, but shot 7 times. And on the other hand, stark contrast of a young man with an assault rifle walking toward police, and he's not shot or aggressively approached. So we know the importance of this, and I think this work group, Dr. Oliver, gave us some very great information, and I wanted to share that with the group this morning. One, it said to ensure that recommendations are tailored to ensure that they can be implemented by all agencies. So one thing that was very important that the group identified was that some of these recommendations, we hope that they're are not prohibited from implementation because of the size of the department or the resources available. And so the thought was to consider statewide programs to assist smaller agencies in the recruiting part of this. Agencies should conduct a job task analysis for the agencies and develop standardized knowledge, skills, and ability for the job. So in other words, he had talked about the importance of hiring based on character and not physical ability. A lot of times that, we're in Fayetteville, Fort Bragg, we have a lot of prior military who check all of the boxes for the physical strength and ability, but the character, it says that we need to make sure that our agencies are hiring based on character traits. And so the group identified and Dr. Oliver highlighted the importance of integrity, that everyone in the workforce should have integrity, and that if you hire people who have those skills, and particularly that particular trait, that typically you will have a good officer. Also, human diversity skills, that they're service orientated, that a lot of times, some of the officers need to look at it as that they're delivering a public service to the community, and that they're there to assist and work in the community. And 99.9% of our brave men and women in law enforcement practice that. But to highlight the importance of that team compatibility, that they fit into a team structure, that that they are understand that they're good team players, that they have oral communication skills. A lot of times you have the right person, but can they articulate their point across to members in the community that they may interact with, was very important. Written communication, that they want to make sure that, as a big part of their job, as we know, are about the writing up the various requirements. And so they wanted to make sure that a good employee has written communication skills, that they're motivated. Motivation was a big part of it. Good decision-making skills. And of course, we know that they are required, law enforcement members are required to make split-second decisions. They wanted to make sure that they are a good processor and making good decisions. Human relation skills, which is very important, to understand how to interact with human beings, because at the end of the day, this is about people, and the relationships that you have with each other are very important. And self-control, that make sure that temperament is proper, and that reactions, as we said before, a law enforcement officer that has a bad day at work is not like me or some of the other jobs. If they have a bad day, or have some personal things going on, that could result in injury or death of a citizen. And so want to make sure that they have those self-control skills, planning and organizing skills, and that they're performance driven. And so agencies seeking to hire with strong emotional intelligence was the next section, to focus on the 4 domains of self-awareness, self-management, to be able to manage themselves and their behavior, social awareness, that in light of current events or circumstances or backgrounds, that they understand that the social component of these relationships is very important, and relationship management. And then the next section talked about agencies should carefully consider who is doing the recruiting. That's another thing, that sometimes there's implicit bias, or people who have their own perception of what they think a good workforce should look like, and they're the problem. And so a lot of times they're the gatekeeper to keep those who are different, or who don't see things their way out, and it causes a culture that causes problems down the road, is what he said. And ensure adequate training for the recruiters, and to conduct those hiring panels, and those conducting background searches. Work to enhance that, work with the Justice Academy to create training. It also talked about the importance of growing potential candidates organically, that you start with the people in our communities at a very young age, and start them interacting with the police, and they would make future law enforcement officers or candidates, and they would also already have a commitment, 1, to the community, and 2, to the agency that they've been able to work with. And so he pointed out that the FBI uses that tactic, that they use paid internships and other things to increase the homegrown workforce. And so work with Standards Commission to determine whether it be appropriate to include these requirements into the North Carolina Administrative Code, I think is a governance part of that, which is very, very important. And consider making this training a requirement for state accreditation, that there be some consistency between, you have various agencies who do the accreditation, as I understand it, and that they want to make sure that some of these requirements can be embedded in that, which is very important to these departments and agencies. And so consider whether agencies should designate specific personnel for tasks related to hiring. And so I guess you would have a specific department, kind of like most corporations that concentrated on that. Ensure that the people are representative of the community that they serve. We talked about that in depth, and how important it is that you have people who represent the community. We have a diverse community here in Fayetteville, And we're working hard on the diversity of our law enforcement agency, which right now is not exactly, doesn't correlate exactly with the diversity of the community. So I think that is a great goal to aspire to. Ensure that hiring practice require the following at a minimum: comprehensive personal history test that is different than commissions and specific to agencies. And there's a questionnaire, so I may go to Ms. Dismukes to kind of clarify that on our notes.
Sure, Mayor Coleman, sorry, I'm having some trouble with my mute button here with the PowerPoint up. That's basically the question that we are still trying to sort out while we are making these recommendations. Right now, both commissions require a personal history statement when there is an applicant to be certified for either the CJ Standards Commission or the Sheriff Standards Commission. And so the question is whether we want to recommend in this best practices document that all of these things are to be a part of, that each agency have an additional personal history statement, and whether it's tailored to that agency, whether it's broader than the commission's, or whether we want to talk about revising the commission's personal history statements that are used for entrance into the profession. So that's the question there for discussion.
Okay, thank you. And also, as we look to that, of course, medical exams and psychological exams to see if, as we look a little more in depth into the person themselves, that we want to make sure that we understand their medical or psychological condition as much as we can. Another important point was to consider restructuring some of the barriers for hiring. That a lot of times we're leaving some very good people on the sidelines who may have had minor criminal flare-ups in their past, in their youth, marijuana possession charges or so forth. And a lot of times these would make good officers because they have empathy. They've been there. They've been on the other side of it, and they understand both perspectives. And so, sometimes we are so structured in our policy that it takes the common practice out. And I think that's an important part, and it will probably increase the diversity as well, because we know disproportionately encounters with the police department in the African American and minority communities is disproportionate to others, and so that leaves a lot of opportunity on the sideline. And again, agencies growing their own talents. I talked about the FBI Honors Program, Police Explorers Program, and other paid interns that should go to high schools and college-age students. Consider adopting the CALEA standard for diversity in recruiting, specifically for North Carolina. Maybe Ms. Leslie can give a little bit more detail about what that involves, or one of the other committee members, Chief Davis or Sheriff Ingram.
My understanding, I think this might be better to punt to Chief Davis on this one, but my understanding is that there are specific diversity requirements and standards in CALEA. And because we in the state of North Carolina are considering, both commissions are looking at right now a state accreditation process that would be in addition to the CALEA accreditation. And we want to consider adopting specifically that standard for diversity in the state accreditation process. So Chief, if you're still on, and you probably know more about that than we do, if you wouldn't mind speaking to it.
Yes, one of the CALEA standards, there are actually several CALEA standards that deal with diversity in police departments and processes for hiring and what best practices look like. And part of that has a lot to do with making sure that those individuals that are recruiting, they actually represent the demographic of the communities that they serve. In some agencies that is actually the case. However, it's not necessarily the case in all agencies. And also ensuring that the efforts in recruiting span beyond just receiving applications, via the internet, and individuals walking and being more intentional about visiting locations where there is a higher probability of hiring individuals that are bilingual, African American, for instance, having recruit fairs at HBCUs and also ensuring that the workplace represents, the LGBTQ community and demonstrating in a myriad of ways the inclusiveness and the welcoming attitude that the department has for anybody of any race or ethnic background or sexual orientation. So that's just, on a high level, what the CALEA standards, sort of look for. And it doesn't have to necessarily be CALEA. It could be any accreditation entity that the state decides to, stand up or develop as a best practice standard for hiring, or a guide for that matter, because a lot of agencies have a difficult time with hiring diverse police forces.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chief. Also, agencies should implement an early warning system to identify problem officers and work toward remedies. A lot of times we have bad actors. We look the other way, or some law enforcement look the other way because they are considered essential or they have good characteristics. But we need to have some system that identifies problems early and be able to deal with it so that it doesn't fester or spread throughout the culture of the agency or the department. And agencies should prioritize having a diverse command staff. Diversity should be reflected throughout organizations, was something else that Dr. Oliver pointed out. Recommend the expansion of the CJ Fellows program to all 100 counties. Support budget to ensure that all counties are covered and administrative expenses are addressed. So either Chief Davis or Mr. Smoots, you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So the CJ Fellows program that was started last year, I believe the first class is just getting ready to graduate, was not available to all 100 counties in North Carolina. It was limited based upon the size of the counties. Has recently been expanded through the legislature to apply to, now we have 80 counties, but there are still 20 counties that are uncovered. Being able to have this program apply to all 100 counties would allow us to incentivize others to go into the law enforcement profession across the entire state, no matter the size of the county that the person comes from. Because as we know, there are all different types of sub-communities within a county. And so just the size of the county might not be the best indicator for the individuals we want to try to incentivize into the profession. And so we want to support the expansion of the CJ Fellows program to all 100 counties and support the budget to do that. This recommendation number 2 would be probably a legislative recommendation on our part.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And recommend the collection of certain data to ensure that we're prioritizing diverse recruitment collected by the commission's demographic data of those entering BLET, demographic data of those that graduate. And Chief Davis kind of pointed out that there were so many minorities that entered into the program, but there were a significant number of them that did not graduate. And so we need to make sure that we have some tracking mechanism, some measurables that we can have goals and standardize. That is the way I understood the conversation, and demographic data on all employees. And then as we finished, it was recommended that Criminal Justice Education and Training Standards Commission and the Sheriff's Standard Commission work together to ensure that there's consistency. It was very beneficial for us to have the benefit of Sheriff Ingram and Chief Davis, who are part of the 2 different commissions to talk about that there needs to be some consistency in some areas of a gap. And so if Chief, if you wanted to kind of point an example out of something that we talked about or that you think would be relevant to this.
One of the areas in our conversation had to do with drug history and the fact that, some of our young people have experimented with drugs. And, say for instance, there is a 12-month window where an applicant would be disqualified from a process if they had experimented with drugs, within that period. That does eliminate quite a few applicants. However, we know that over the years, the activities of our young people have changed, and it's very hard to find applicants that have not experimented with marijuana. And, we just talked about what are some barriers and what are the impediments to, potentially hiring a person that may have made a mistake in their past and not allow that mistake to keep them from being able to pursue a career in law enforcement. Is it that serious? So some of the guidelines have been in place, in departments for many, many years. And this is a good opportunity, not just for departments to look at their guidelines, but also at the state level for the commission to potentially look at guidelines as well. And we already sort of talked about the academy, the basic law enforcement training academy, and potentially having processes in place that help our applicants and our candidates that make it to that part of the process to be successful in the process. And that success looks like having larger classes graduate, as opposed to having smaller classes where individuals didn't make it through the process because they weren't provided with information or support or even tutoring, throughout the process.
Thank you, Chief Davis. And finally, recommend support for the creation of state accreditation program already underway by the Standards Commission. Recommend the funding. I guess this would be a legislative recommendation, or we'll recommend it back to the task force to consider recommending to the legislator funding for an administrator and technology and administrative needs of a state accredited program. And so that those are the highlights of our first meeting under workforce. Basically, summarizing that, it said that we hire based on the character and those other components versus the physical skill. And Dr. Oliver was clear to say that a lot of those physical traits and attributes can be trained, but the character is something that is from within. And so I think that's great. The plan now is at our next meeting to reach a consensus amongst the work group and to forward these recommendations from that particular section back to the task force. And then our subsequent meetings will start to focus on how to promote public safety and build community support with the law enforcement and the community. So I look forward to that. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to work with these professionals and look forward to great things in the future. I will say at the top of the hour, I may have to jump off. So if you see me disappear, I've got a work conflict, but thank you.
And thank you very much, Mayor Colvin, and thank you, Work Group 4 for your report. And thank you again, Leslie Dismukes, for all of your support there. Mayor Colvin, I got to give you props. 20 minutes. I mean, you got it timed. Trying to set this example, set the standard for the rest of this meeting. So thank you very much. So everyone, you had the opportunity to hear the work that they've been doing and this particular work group 1 has been doing. So now what we want to do is open it up to any thoughts or feelings or questions that you have about what you just heard. Is there more information that you might need? But also, are there some suggestions, some feedback, some additional resources, some different perspectives that you would like to add? And you heard about the 5 different ones. I don't think I need to repeat them again because it was a very thorough explanation and you have that information with you. So I'm going to open it up for a discussion now. Thoughts, feelings, suggestions, anything.
Karen, this is Leslie. I can put anything back up on the screen if anyone needs it to help in the discussion. So just let me
Okay,
know.
that'll be great. All right then.
Ronnie Smith here. I have a question on the CJ Fellowship. I understand that program, this is the first year, and you're looking at maybe, I think someone said something about 80 counties out of 100. I probably need just a little more information about this program because I will be very interested in my county and so many other counties being part of this. We talked about it, but I didn't get all the gist of how they're selected and what have you.
Karen, I can talk briefly on that just because I'm very familiar with it. It was a brainchild of Stephen Combs, who heads the criminal justice training and standards for the Department of Justice. And we got it authorized about 2 years ago. And the first class of them, maybe 15 of them, have cycled through. And it's modeled on the Teaching Fellows program, which people have some familiarity with. High schoolers, bright, want to go into teaching. The state will lend them money to get their 4-year degree. And if they teach in a North Carolina public school for 4 years, that loan gets forgiven. And this will pay for the community college education for 2 years for any high school graduate. And then if they go into law enforcement for 4 years, their loan will be forgiven. And the legislature has approved it for applicants from the 80 smallest counties. So basically it's the big urban counties which are not eligible. And my estimate is just that the proponents were rural legislators, and I think they were worried that, you know, the big county students would take up all the slots. But really, we need talented people. There should, my view, there should not be discrimination based on what county you're from in North Carolina. It should be open to everybody. This week, I just welcomed the second class of fellows. We have about 13, 14, 15. We have authorization for 100, but this is one of those issues that's in the budget, that's fallen through the budget cracks, where we don't have a resolved budget. So we're actually paying for it out of DOJ's budget. We need the legislature and the governor to finalize the budget. And it's only if like 350 grand a year to do this. So the ask, I think, of the task force will ultimately be, let's fully fund it and let's make sure it's open to every North Carolina high school graduate.
Thank you.
Briefly, this is Henderson Hill. I wanted to second and praise many of the comments that Chief Davis made regarding the CALEA standards. I would like to issue a caution that when I hear the cadets program and the fellows programs and the explorer programs, from my service on the Mecklenburg County Civil Service Board, one of the problems was this funnel that created a direct line to our fire services, fire department services, and our police services of people who were sons and nephews and so forth of police officers and firefighters. And it really excluded folks whose backgrounds did not include those programs. And I think one of the dangers we have in recruiting is the need to expand the pool. And it sounds like there's good work being done on that. I would just sort of emphasize that that's the direction that we need to go in. And we need to recognize that there are existing direct lines that continue to populate our police departments with people who don't reflect the community and whose attitudes are very, very different from the communities in which they now serve.
And if I could add to that, I totally agree, Mr. Hill. You know, just traditionally, sometimes you have sort of a matriculation of, you know, officers that come from individuals who are already, whose parents are in the industry, brothers, and we certainly encourage those individuals to seek law enforcement careers, but to also expand opportunities for individuals who are less fortunate and don't have access like that. So the gateway to police departments really needs to be managed by individuals who understand the holistic, you know, approach to recruiting homegrown, you know, individuals that come from the community. And in Durham, and I think some other cities may have it, we have sort of a homegrown program where we really try to encourage individuals who come from the community to be a part of the organization as well. So thank you, Mr. Hill, for your comments.
This is John Ledney. I'd like to echo that, both Mr. Hill and Chief Davis. And I think that those are good statements, but I also want to caution that there are many avenues into law enforcement service. all should be open, all should be diverse, all should be looked at as a way to bring in qualified, diverse candidates. But legacy candidates are a good thing at times. Also, these other programs, the Fellows Program, the Explorer Program, and so on, also have been ways that we get qualified candidates who have been taught from an early age what the value of service as a law enforcement officer is and how important that is, rather than someone who maybe later in life has seen that as an avenue of service, which is also good. But I don't want to discount the fact that someone at an early age who has expressed an interest and has learned hopefully the right thing, the right way, the right culture, and that's a related but different conversation, that they are not discounted because of that. So, for example, I am a product of the Explorer Program. I was an Explorer from the time I was in high school, and I learned an awful lot about service through that program, and not about being a police officer, but about how a police officer or a police agency is part of the community it serves, and how it does need to be diverse, and all those things that were good. And if our programs are structured appropriately, I think we will get good candidates. And like the Fellows Program, where I think it's a good way, but it's only one way. As was said, there's funding for 100 students. There's 100 counties. That's one per. That's not a lot. It's actually a drop in a bucket. We need many more qualified candidates from diverse backgrounds to seek law enforcement as a career. Our BLET programs across the state are closing because of lack of students, and that is not helpful. So it's not a quantity issue as much as it's a quality issue. And if we enhance programs like the Fellows Program and others, where we get quality, where we get diversity, and we get people who generally want to serve, then those are things I think that would help us overall over a long term.
This is Tally Wells with the Council on Developmental Disabilities. One quick technical question. I was wondering if we're able to use either the chat or the Q&A. Neither are working, and I know we may have more questions and comments than we have time for. And then second, we in the mental health community, there's been a strong push for what's called certified peer specialists, and I think it's such an important discussion and such an important balance of making sure that we allow folks who have been involved in the criminal justice system and in terms of being incarcerated and others to have a chance to be part of law enforcement because they understand. I also sort of wonder if there's additional ways that something like a certified peer specialist or something where folks who can be integrated into sort of the system in a way that they can really have their voice heard, but they have relationships in a better way, so that we're not just looking at folks who have had minor offenses, but folks who after a period of time have also had more extended offenses. And I know that there's a balance because we also don't want necessarily quote unquote law enforcement that have a troubled history that could continue. But I just wonder if it's so important to have that sort of context of people who have lived experience of what it means, and that we're making sure that we're having as an integrated law enforcement as possible. Thank you.
Tally, I just wanted to respond to your question about the Q&A and chat. Neither function are on for this meeting, but if any task force member wants to email Ellen Spoler their questions that they don't want to say out loud, we will make sure they're part of the minutes.
Good morning. This is Eric Hooks. Glad to be with you today. There's a lot of great information. I'm proud to be from Cumberland County, where the esteemed mayor presides in Fayetteville. I will say that I am a firm believer that an officer's past conduct is subject to disclosure to the court, and really am an advocate that appropriate discovery information is provided. I do want us to ensure that as we look at ideas of perhaps relaxing some of the background requirements for an officer, such as a drug transgression prior to coming into law enforcement, that we also look at the back end of that. And for those that advocate the relaxation of such drug usage for applicants so that we can widen that door for minority applicants, that there be some balance, that that same officer that we have encouraged to come into the system is not automatically subject to the withering attacks for that prior conduct in court that undermines their credibility, and cases that are presented in court are undermined based on that previous conduct as well. So we want to look at second and tertiary consequences of that and make sure that we have that balance moving forward.
It's Henderson Hill again. I mean, I can't help but acknowledge that one thing that is not permitted in court is the history, the abuse history of law enforcement officers when it's entirely relevant. And I think that the balance is right. We've got to have that balance. But the experiences of people in the community should not prevent them from pursuing careers and roles in public safety, serving public safety. And I take Tally's comments to heart that we've got to look more expansively about how we meet the needs of public safety and how folks with lived experience can contribute to that. And I think other parts of the task force is looking at how we can enforce the standards of conduct on law enforcement officers. And one mechanism is that prosecutions and the case pays a price for violations by law enforcement and other governmental agencies. And one price is to have that misconduct impact the resolution of the cases. So balance is important, but it's balance in the pursuit of justice, and that requires some give and take on both sides of the handcuffs.
We probably have time for one more comment, question.
Oh, yes, this is Kerwin Pittman. I got a quick question as far as applicants who may be applying for jobs or roles in public safety when it comes to particularly those who have minor offenses. Will the definition of minor offenses be left as a blanket statement, or will we have definitive offenses in which applicants will be approved to proceed? So that may be one of the things we need to think about.
Okay. All righty then. Well, thank you very much for all of your comments. And again, kudos to Work Group 1 for your work thus far. And so moving on, would like to move on to Work Group 2 and would like to call on Secretary Hooks. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Karen. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Mr. Attorney General and Associate Justice Earls, for your outstanding leadership. I'm a firm believer that leadership matters, not just at the top of government, but throughout organizations and in our communities as well. And so I'm really humbled and grateful to serve on this task force and to chair Working Group 2. I'd like to recognize the members of Working Group 2, which include Deborah Dix Maxwell, Angelica Wynn, Tally Wells, Kerwin Pittman, Sheriff James Clemens, Chief John Letney, and Sergeant Billy Garton. I am also profoundly grateful for the work with Working Group 2 by Substantive Staff Lead Jeff Welty, and also great assistance from Greg Saban from the AG's office as well. I will have our group send some additional information to you after we talk just a little bit about the work that we're doing. And I am mindful that we're still active in a state of emergency. We're in day 172 of the state of emergency and activation at the Emergency Operations Center for our statewide pandemic, but really a global pandemic. But this important work has to and should go on. Working Group 2 is examining policing policy and practices. The group's been assigned a number of areas, and it's a pretty large undertaking with 6 specific topics. 1, use of force. 2, investigations. 3, community policing. 4, pre-arrest diversion and other alternatives to arrest. 5, the appropriate use of school resource officers. And 6, reimagining public safety, reinvesting in community. Our group has met 3 times. The first meeting was an opportunity for members to really identify and express their top passions and priorities. I firmly believe that if you want to engage in firm partnerships, you have to have a great understanding of the members that are moving forward collaboratively in that work. And in that, they included a general discussion of reimagining public safety. Our second meeting addressed 2 topics: the use of force and law enforcement's role in addressing mental illness, substance abuse, and homelessness. The third meeting was a deep dive into the role of school resource officers. All of our meetings have featured excellent speakers. We've had a total of, I believe, 5 excellent speakers who provided members with the opportunity for discussion. And this kind of comes back to some later information that's been pointed out to the group that I would bring to the larger task force. Because we're in the process of not just coming to the meetings, delivering our opinion and walking away with the same opinions that we came to deliver just to have our say, but trying to really work collaboratively and educate ourselves and each other about the issues in community, about what professional public safety is all about. It's really taken a lot of time. So the group has not formally voted on any specific recommendations. However, but based on members' comments during the meetings and responses to a survey, which I think has been very effective for us of the group, several proposals have strong initial support and appear likely to give direction for the group. Among those proposals are the following: in use of force. And again, we will push this out to you. Requiring law enforcement agencies to collect uniform data on uses of force and submit the data to a state or federal repository. 2, under use of force, encouraging or requiring agencies to conduct sentinel event reviews when deadly force is used. I'll talk a little bit about that later as well, because as to whether or not that sentinel review is an internal review or an external review, and certainly open the door for other working group members to have some input within our time frame. 3, encouraging or requiring officers to issue a warning when feasible when using deadly force. That certainly tracks the tenets of Supreme Court case law 1985 Tennessee versus Garner. Many departments already have that written in their policy, but I could not speak to how uniform that is across every agency in North Carolina. We note that there are still many issues under discussions related to use of force, including what standards for use of force and what they should be. For example, when people are only a danger to themselves, as well as what a sentinel event review should look like, who should conduct it, where should it be based, and what should it be like. Another area that we wanted to go ahead and just tackle on the forefront, because I think it allows us to broaden our scope of thinking, is reinventing public safety. And whereas this may be one of the most difficult challenges, I think that it lays the groundwork for the collaboration and the perspectives of everybody in the working group. In reinventing public safety, we discussed requiring officers to have crisis intervention team training. Also supporting communities that want to develop alternative strategies for addressing calls involving mental health, substance abuse, and homelessness, including co-responder models and models that do not involve law enforcement at all. That we have had some discussions, and we'll have some more information provided to the working group so we can vote out concerning those co-responder models, the CAHOOTS program, which is in Eugene, Oregon, and the STAR program, which I believe is in Denver, Colorado. And we're looking forward to having greater discussions on those and resources brought to us. School resource officers. One of the areas that we talked about was the support and continued development of or mandate for school justice partnerships. We heard from Judge Corpening, who is a leader in our community, particularly in the New Hanover County, and he and others have expanded school justice partnerships throughout the state, but there are areas of resistance to truly looking deeper into school justice partnerships. And we're very fortunate that Tally Wells is on our working group, and Deborah Dix Maxwell have great familiarity with Judge Corpening and those ideas that that were pushed forward, and they are more than welcome to jump in after I run through this to add their insights to that. 2, collect and publish online uniform data on school discipline and school-based juvenile court referrals, including information about SRO involvement, information by age, race, and school. Of course, we would propose this all within the confines of the confidentiality requirements that govern education as well as health. And also we discuss enhanced training for SROs, generally in line with recommendations that we expect to be forthcoming from the Task Force on Safer Schools, who has done a lot of work and have a lot of exciting material that I think is going to be beneficial to the state of North Carolina. Next, enhancing training for school personnel about the proper role of SROs. Another area to support efforts to address behavior issues before they rise to the level of SRO involvement, including adding, and this requires investment, adding school counselors, social workers, and/or psychologists. Likewise, there are still issues under discussion in our work group related to the role of SROs within schools, with racial equity training for school staff, and better processes to reduce the school to prison pipeline, such as progressive discipline before juvenile court referrals, which is also an issue that Working Group 3 we recognize is considering. As noted above, there are tentative possible directions for the group. The group welcomes the feedback from the task force about the ideas, what I've brought forward, and I welcome other working group members to step forward this morning for some additional perspectives if I've not covered the entire gamut of it, which I know there's no way that I could. But just know that our group will refine our recommendations in these areas, and we will explore the remaining topics that have been assigned to our group. And that's it for me right there, Karen, but I would like to offer an opportunity for other working group members to weigh in on within the balance of my time.
This is Tally. I'll just jump in real quick. This state has done a lot of work around school justice partnerships, particularly partnerships between schools and law enforcement and judges. I think we really want to build on that work and really figure out ways, the best ways we can support it. So that's one of the main things that we spent some time looking at on the school justice partnerships and the SRO issue. I think there's still a lot of discussion that we need to have around the use of SROs. But the school, one of the things that I've heard loud and clear in talking about this with fellow task force members, as well as people who are really involved in these issues across the state, is data and transparency, and how critical it is to really link up the data in schools around exclusionary discipline and the data around juvenile court referrals and everything that sort of happens once it gets over onto the criminal side. And also, one of the things that's going to be more challenging is, what about those times where children didn't get arrested, but a school resource officer was somehow involved or wasn't involved? But getting a full picture is really critical, and then being able to go on the internet and look at each school and school system across the state. So that's one of the things that we spent some time on. And then linked to that, which Secretary Hooks talked about, is everything from the sort of the school climate to school-based behavioral health to mental health training for everyone from educators to school bus drivers to the school resource officers, and making sure that we're really providing those supports and services that help decrease the behaviors, help really do what schools are about. Schools are about teaching. So we teach math and reading. Behavior and expectations need to be just a part of that. We can't just punish kids because we expected them to understand how to interact with folks, because they go to school to learn. Thank you.
This is
Thank
Kerwin
you.
Pittman.
Oh.
Oh, excuse me, go ahead.
Thank you, Tally and Secretary Hooks. I am in the county of Judge Corpening, so that memorandum is here, and we have tried to assist them because there has been a reluctance across this state for some counties to initiate having an agreement. Now, that is not heaven, because we are still need to also look at one of the major gateways, which is elementary school suspensions, which occurs within the state of North Carolina also down the road. What we call it here in New Hanover, my task force, I'm saying our parents' council, is we're looking at solutions and not suspensions. So as we go forward with this, I forgot to tell you that, Secretary Hooks, we're making a brochure. We will share that with the task force. Data is needed. The way the state does data on schools is horrible, because I've been requesting it for years. It really needs to be improved so John Q. Public can read and see that Gregory has a high suspension rate. I also would like for somehow the data, and I forgot to mention this, Secretary Hooks, to include whether a child has an IEP, because a lot of children who are mentally challenged are part of the brunt of the school suspension rate sometimes. Thank y'all very much. I'm enjoying working with y'all.
Thank you, Deborah. Again, this is Kerwin Pittman, and I'm not going to speak on the topic of the SROs. That's kind of been covered. But I do want to speak on the use of force topic within our working group. We have made great headway within our working group when it comes to use of force, but yet we still have a way to divulge. So when it comes to Sentinel reviews, my thoughts and my concerns was having an agency in which the officer was involved from when it comes to deadly force doing these reviews. My opinion is that we should particularly utilize outside agencies or outside entities to conduct these reviews for the sake of transparency, not only for the agency, but for the community as well. Another thing in which deadly force, the issue of deadly force, is when somebody poses a risk to themselves, i.e. when somebody is about to commit suicide. Right now on the books, it is possible to use deadly force against these individuals. And in my opinion, we should look at other alternatives. Even though I know that this particular situation may get tricky, we should still look at other alternatives than being able to use deadly force against individuals who are about to commit suicide against themselves. So we still have much headway to get done. And that was just my opinion on the use of force topic.
Do other working group 2 members have input that they'd like to share before we turn it over to the rest of the working task force for comment?
This is Angelica. I just want to echo what has already been said before, but also underscore the importance of having a dialogue of SRO's role in the schools, much less starting at like elementary school. Like what if they should even be there, and if there is a way that instead of investing in SRO officers being in elementary schools, to really more or less invest in more social workers being there, recognizing, I had mentioned before that we know more than ever as it relates to ACEs scores and how that plays a role in every child that comes into the school system. And the reality is elementary school is where the foundation gets set. And so do we really want to set it by having SRO officers policing within the schools, but really investing in social workers and other resources that really look at the child as a whole, and we can set them up with the strongest foundation. You know, Deborah said earlier, like elementary is the entryway, and how can we make that entryway like stronger in a positive way?
And again, I'd like to just say thank you to the great team that comprises Working Group Team, or Working Group 2. They've been extraordinary. Just one other thing on SROs that I don't think that we've fully covered. We've talked about the idea of them in schools and being called in to matters that that most of them would not like to be involved in too. But there's also another role of SROs, and that is external threats to schools. We have gone through the tragedies of Columbine, moving forward to many other times we're in Parkland and those that, and so, and this kind of goes back to what the Attorney General's talked about, you know, whether or not we have people coming into the profession and putting them in positions to be true guardians and to assist and be value added to communities versus a warrior mentality. And so SROs are oftentimes looked at from a law enforcement perspective of being that guardian to prevent the tragedies that we've seen in school shootings, or to respond more quickly because they're already on site.
Secretary Hooks, if I can just say, I appreciate that, because that's something that has crossed my mind in terms of why there has been all of a sudden an increase in SRO officers in schools, just in schools in general. And one of the questions that I did have is, how is that tied to the school shootings, right? Because that seems to me an issue at a greater level that I venture to say we're not going to discuss within this group. And so that, to me, the fact that we live in a country that we have to put SRO officers to protect our kids, I think is a part of a larger issue that that does need to be addressed. And I think that we should acknowledge that, but we really want to be forthright about it, of why we have SRO officers. If they're just there to protect the schools from external threat, that's one thing. But if they're got this other perspective of policing second graders and third graders, that's a different question. And so I would welcome that conversation as well.
This is John Ledney. If I can jump in on the role of the SRO, particularly in the elementary school, I know in many jurisdictions, mine included, we have been asked to put SROs in elementary schools. Some of it is protective, some of it is to keep the campus safe, but most of it is to be a part of the learning environment. To provide a service, as the foundational educational thing, it's also an opportunity for a foundational relationship with law enforcement in a guardian perspective. And that SROs provide more, certainly in elementary school levels, are providing a service more related to coaching and counseling, assisting teachers in the classroom, mentoring, dealing with bullying issues and those kind of things. To help the school environment thrive. There is no policing of second graders from the perspective that they are juveniles and they are not generally involved in criminal activity. If they're involved in activity that violates school rules, that falls upon the school administration. And I think the key to that, as some others have said, is first of all, you need to pick the right school resource officer. You need to have the right person, the right experience, the right attitude. But beyond that, you need an umbrella of a good memorandum of understanding, which identifies specifically to that district, what is the role of an SRO? What does that district, that school community, that law enforcement agency see as the role of the SRO versus what is the role of the school administration? And that's very important. These school justice partnerships that talks about those things, those are very important as well. And we do need to carry those out statewide. But we also need at its core a very good understanding of what an SRO is to do. And they really should not be involved in school discipline. That's school administration. And that should keep the school resource officer focused on that school safety, on the mentoring, the coaching, the developing relationship, and showing the positive side of law enforcement to students at a very young age. There was some research that was shown to our working group from the state that showed a 67% reduction in issues in elementary school once an SRO was present. And I'm not characterizing that as well as Deputy Secretary Lasser did, but at least that part of the research shows some real advantages. But I think we only get to the advantages when we have a good structure in place, when we have that good MOU, that good school justice partnership, and ultimately the right SRO. And to that extent, I think the school system and maybe the community needs to be involved in selecting that SRO. It should be one of the best officers an agency has, not someone that they want to put somewhere because of problems. That just creates more problems. I don't think that's going on as much in North Carolina as it is in other states, but I think some of the problems we've seen across the country with SROs is because it's the wrong officer in the school. There's not that cooperative, collaborative focus on enhancing school community and school safety. And I don't think there's good MOUs in place in some cases. So we have some good models here in North Carolina, certainly in New Hanover County, Wake County, some other counties. And I think to the extent we have that foundation to build upon, we should be expanding that to show what works and let each local community decide what that role should be and be very clear and open and transparent about it. And then gathering the data to show what is the public safety problem, what are SROs doing, what are they not doing? And the ultimate goal would be reduce incidents, not necessarily reduce the output. It's the outcome we want to see in a safer school with better relationships across the board.
I'll just quickly say this is why General Stein and Justice Charles, we need y'all to stop time so that we can have more time to discuss these issues, because these are really difficult, complex, important, critical issues to our kids, and really are honored to have the time to discuss this. But we're really struggling with just the need to get things out and make sure that we're making recommendations while being able to hear the evidence, because there was such rich information we were given with the need to sort of make recommendations. So I don't know how we do that. And I was sort of joking about stopping time, but it is just a struggle we're wrestling with.
And Kerwin Pittman here, and I just want to echo what Tally said. We do need some allocation or for additional time if need be, but as well as I want to switch lanes right quick and say one of the things that we will be looking at as well is ending North Carolina's participation in the federal government's equitable sharing program for civil asset forfeitures. So I don't know if any of you viewed the documentation in the shared point, which is very and thoroughly putting in. This is pretty much low-hanging fruit that I believe that our group can come to a consensus in the task force pretty quickly, because this right here targets disproportionately and gives incentives for law enforcement to target minority communities for profit. And this right here is pretty much unacceptable under North Carolina law, state law. Pretty much any incentives from forfeiture, a civil asset forfeiture, goes to schools. But when it comes to a federal level, it actually kicks back down to the actual department in which who was doing the season of these assets forfeitures. Thank you.
So if I can just jump in real quick to say, there's probably a couple of different alternatives for how to address the time and discussion issue you raised. One that has come to my mind is that the presentations be done as videos that all task force members watch, and then the task force meeting time is where you get to discuss. Maybe need to work out how you would do questions for the presenters, but at any rate, I hear you, and I think there's some possible ways we can improve that.
Thank you.
So a lot's been presented. I want to turn it over to the rest of the task force to see if there's any other questions or comments, things that should be considered by working groups too as they go back to consider recommendations.
Yeah, Michael?
Representative Moore.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the discussion. There will be some overlap with Working Group 3 because we do have juvenile justice issues and school to prison pipeline. We don't necessarily want to, redo and have the conversation over and over again. So maybe Secretary Hooks and I can talk about that. I just wanted to mention one thing that we'll probably be addressing. As long as the avenue is open for SRO officers to put elementary school kids in the juvenile justice system, maybe, we will be looking at possible statutory recommendations that 6-year-olds shouldn't be in the juvenile justice system in the first place. North Carolina is the only state by statute puts 6-year-olds and older into our juvenile justice system. So that may be one thing to look at that takes away the ability of SROs referring kids to juvenile court before they have any understanding of what a court system is and the consequences of behavior they need to be learning. So I thought I'd add that, and we'll try and separate the topics so we can get good recommendations from each group. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Morey. Look forward to doing that. Nothing would be more welcome for the Department of Public Safety, in particular Deputy Secretary Lassiter as well. We have, moved forward with not just having officers just being able to get them in there, but really pushing that they have to go through a juvenile court counselor, if they ever get to that, and that we don't ever want to see a 5-6-year-old showing up at our doorstep for that. And so, but it has happened, and we recognize that, and that is not the path that we look for from the state. We're not looking for kids. We want to meet them where they are in the community and get them the help and support that they need.
Secretary Hooks and Chairman Pittman, I would just say that Working Group 4 is looking at fines and fees. The task force has already taken a preliminary position on that. We're looking to see if there's an appropriate supplement to that. And part of that inquiry is whether court fines and fees is really a regressive tax on the most vulnerable of our community to provide for an important public service, justice. And I think your inquiry into the civil forfeiture, asset forfeiture, I think is critically important. It goes beyond what Working Group 4 is doing. It's a different topic, but the threat to racial equity that arises from the incentivizing of law enforcement to make the decisions, both arrest and stop, are critically important to the issue. And I commend that work and note that although we spent a good bit of time on a related issue, that is sort of beyond the scope of what we're looking at.
Task force members, I just wanted to also let you know that asset forfeiture is in the idea bank for Working Group 1, which will be tackling accountability issues over at least 2 meetings upcoming.
Any other questions or thoughts?
Sure. This is Mujtab Mohammed, North Carolina Senate. Question for Secretary Hooks. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Secretary Hooks, just I know you mentioned as far as looking at use of force and standards, and I'm sure your work group is, you guys have already done a lot of great work in getting to understand some of the issues and some of the solutions that we can provide. But as far as looking at stricter standards and requiring de-escalation where possible, is that something that your work group's going to be looking at?
Yes, the use of force is really so broad, and we've had some great presentations on it and model policies that are out there. One of the things to note is that various departments define use of force in various ways. And so, and there's also a difference between what a public perception of use of force is versus how a department may define it. Is handcuffing a use of force? Is and the like. And so, some of those things that, that use of a baton, pepper spray, guns, those are the things that are traditionally thought of as use of force, but there has to be a deeper discussion, and we'll need that time to talk about if there's an agreed upon preference as to how do we clearly define use of force, one that is acceptable to the community, one that's acceptable to law enforcement leaders, both on the police and sheriff's sides, to really collaboratively move forward, because we really have to have buy-in as to it, so that we're speaking the same language all across government and communities, what we are doing and what that communication is, so that there will lead to a little less misunderstanding.
And absolutely, and that's one of the reasons I bring it up, because I think the task force is in great position to make sure we recommend a strong baseline, united definition of use of force for all of our statewide law enforcement agencies. And I just hope that our task force can take a real good look at making sure that we are looking at de-escalation when and where possible, to avoid a lot of things that we've continued to see, and look at also principles of necessity and proportionality to the use of force. So thank you for your time.
Absolutely, and I invite Sheriff Clemens, Chief Letney, or Sergeant Gardner, if they're on from our working group, if they want to add more. I hadn't seen Sergeant Garton, but he's very involved with use of force and training as well. So, Sheriff.
Yes, sir. Secretary Hooks and others. As we're looking at the use of forces, and as Secretary Hooks has said, the way that agencies defined it, everyone has their own particular definition of the use of force, when the use of force, how. I would agree that if given an opportunity to give those orders, to escalate, to avoid that use of force, is what most law enforcement officers want to do anyway. We don't wake up in the morning and say, well, we're going to go out here and get into a fight or confrontation. Most of us out here that are doing the job and the work in the communities, we want to have a peaceful community. We want to have better working relationships with the community, to make sure that we're understanding what it is that they're dealing with, and they understand what the law is. I hear a lot of the training and the issues of use of force and the over policing of communities, but yet I don't hear anyone speaking about how does law enforcement get to those particular areas. Why are they in those areas? They're not just driving down the street. Most of these agencies are call driven. And when they respond to these areas, this is the training that needs to be put in place for de-escalation, but also too, the community needs to understand what lawful laws are, not what they want the law to be or what they think the law to be, but what the law actually is, and taking that time to communicate and make sure. One thing that we're working in our community to explain to people is you have that right to file that complaint if you don't think things are going the way that you perceive them to be at that particular stop, at your residence, or wherever the issue may be. But at the same token, law enforcement officers have to understand a better way of de-escalating and making sure that we're doing the things that need to be done. But you still have to understand the law is the law. We're not there to create the law. We're there to be practitioners of the law, but yet it's our also responsibility to explain to the community what the law is, so that there is an understanding. But I don't hear a lot of talk about that. I hear talk about law enforcement, training, but we're losing that important partner, which is the community. And we need to make sure that we're looking at that. But use of force as a whole, we need to make sure that we're understanding why that use of force is taking place, who's using the use of force, what the circumstances are. And what we're seeing today is not what use of force is about. What we're seeing today is abuse of power, abuse of that authority, and we having these officers that are taking actions that they should not be taking. I hear the conversations about there are two different laws. There are laws for the public, and then there are laws for law enforcement. I'm one to believe that there's one law, there should be one law, and what's good for the public should be good for law enforcement officers also.
Thank you, Sheriff Clemens. Thank you very much. Like us all too, we're going to transition to a 5-minute break, give everybody some time to digest and prepare for the next two working groups. If everyone could be ready at 11:35. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, I know that was a short break. It was only 5 minutes, but wanted to call us all back together again if, so that we can move on. So want to remind you that we have covered a lot this morning, and wanted to make sure that if there are any questions that you might have, or if there are any other comments that you want to make, if you would just go ahead and make sure that you email Ellen so that she can have those again as part of the minutes and as part of the record so that they can be addressed. Also, just wanted to let you know that because of our co-chairs are so good with their time management, in case those of you have been monitoring the time, everybody's been getting a couple of extra minutes just because we do have the time. So just wanted to let you know that. But right now, I would like to go ahead and move on to our work group number 3, and Representative Maury, the floor is yours. But it'll be yours better with your mute button off. There you go.
Okay, and I'm sorry because my screen went blank and all I see is Zoom. But if you can hear me and I'm on, I'm not sure how to.
We can hear you and you're on, and we can actually see you. So.
Okay, all I see is Zoom. So I don't know how to get around that. Okay, anyway, thank you. These reports have been great. And I'd like to just report on our working group 3 and what we have been doing. We've had 3 meetings, and I really appreciate everyone in our group, and I hope they will enter in and add some. But we have District Attorney Jim Woodall on our group, County Commissioner Ronnie Smith, Tara Callahan with the Conservatives on criminal justice reform, and Senator Mustafa Muhammad from Charlotte. We've had 3 meetings, and the main areas we've been asked to discuss are pretrial release and bail, charging decisions by prosecutors, racial equity training for court personnel, decriminalization or lessening of criminal penalties, and the juvenile justice system school to prison pipeline. So we have a lot on our plate, and I think knowing that and looking at the schedule that we were to report recommendations today, that's exactly what we were prepared to do. And I think we will be voting on 2 of them. We've come up with 9 recommendations so far, and we all have voted unanimously on all these recommendations. Our first meeting was on August the 5th, and every one of the people in the work group talked about priorities of issues they would like to address, and take on the first topic, which we felt would be easiest to find consensus after a presentation by John Rubin with the School of Government on racial equity training for court-involved personnel, and had a good discussion. Professor Rubin talked about the Racial Equity Network that has been ongoing at the School of Government for a few years, that it's a robust training, that it's a continuous training. They work in collaboration with other agencies. It was 2-year training offered every 3 months, and they started out with public defenders. And so we listened to the presentation, we discussed it, and we did come up with a recommendation that I think will be before the task force in a few minutes about every member in the court system, and also probation, parole, the juvenile justice system, judges, defense attorneys, prosecutors, to have robust, continuous racial equity training as a part of their employment. So that will be coming up. We got into our second meeting on August 19th. Everyone was present, and the topic that we looked into were the charging decisions, the prosecution role, and overcriminalization. This was a lot to deal with. In our hour and a half, we were led by District Attorney Jim Woodall, who talked about prosecuting, overcharging, And it was really a great discussion that Jim spoke, and I'll let him add to this once I do the overview, of deprioritizing certain offenses. And that most charging decisions are not made by the DA, but they're made by law enforcement or magistrates or even citizen warrants, and we should be aware of that. That pre-charging decisions can be impacted by robust diversion programs and deflect people from the court process, which really enhances more racial equity than inequity. And that the DA should be guided by just, proper, equitable considerations, stop multiple charges, stop horizontal boxcarring cases or vertical, especially with drug offenses, and to look at the charging of status offenses like habitual status offenders. Danny Spiegel spoke to us. He was an assistant DA in Durham, and he used to be a public defender. He talked a lot about how the DA's office looks back retroactively to see if there are racial disparities in superior court pleas, to check their own biases and accountability. Talked a little bit about the use of mandatory minimums or sentencing enhancements, like a firearm by a felon or drug charges within 1,000 feet of schools. A lot of discussion about marijuana charges, that African Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested than whites on marijuana charges. And the need for more therapeutic courts or drug courts, not to simply prosecute, but to get treatment to people, especially addressing the racial disparities. At our second meeting, Amisha Cooper with the Attorney General's office spoke about the project of overcriminalization that they are working on. We'll give some input to this task force at a later time, and really looking into behaviors that become criminalized, but they don't jeopardize the community safety, like a failure to return property, vagrancy, trespass, city ordinances, begging, housing code violations, with an effort to say, should we reclassify some of the offenses to infractions or decriminalize? And we heard extensive presentations once again from Professor Jessica Smith, government, who we all heard from on our first task force meeting. And she's really digging down into the data, which is very helpful. What we need. And just to recap what her initial presentation to us all were, in 2019, we had almost 2 million criminal charges in North Carolina. 1.6 million were misdemeanors. And 1 million of those being traffic offenses. So that was on our menu to really look at and see where we should go from there. We talked about citations in lieu of arrest, and that there is a project for 4 counties to look into using citations in lieu of arrest to see what the impact on racial disparities would be for those arrested versus those released with a summons to come to court. We talked about where can we get the most bang for our buck, and looking at overcriminalization, looking at city ordinances, looking especially at the traffic offenses that are criminalized, like window tinting or expired registrations, no insurance. And could we decriminalize these to make them infractions? And finally, I think it became very apparent, and I think we will have a recommendation today, we need good racial data. And that is contained within the Administrative Office of the Courts, the ACES system. They produce annually the tally report, and that we need to include the racial data in the tally report every during their annual report. So we had a third meeting, a special meeting this Wednesday for the working group simply to discuss the information we have received and what would our recommendations be to present to the task force. So today we have 9 recommendations, and we will just discuss them, and then I think the chairs will decide on which ones we would have a vote on. But all of these 9 recommendations, can y'all hear me? I'm getting some texts.
We can now, Marcia. There was a time when it was breaking up a little bit, but we could still hear you. We were just worried we wouldn't be able to, but you've been clear of late.
Okay, and I apologize, my video went out, so let me know if you have any problems.
It's very clear right now. Thank you.
Thank you. The first recommendation, and once again, our group was unanimous, that we recommend the Conference of District Attorneys follow all the ABA standards in the prosecution of criminal offenses and develop mandatory training using principles contained in the state of Washington's comprehensive rule RCW 13.40.077. And I know no one has seen that, but we will get more information on that. But that was our first recommendation for the prosecutors to follow these standards when charging and making charging decisions. Second recommendation is all people held in jail on misdemeanor charges after the initial appearance shall have a first appearance before a district court judge within 48 hours or at the next scheduled session of district court. This required misdemeanor first appearance must be scheduled at a time that allows for counsel to meet with the clients and to receive and review the individual's criminal history record prior to the proceeding. In North Carolina, anyone charged with a felony must have a mandatory first appearance within 98 hours. Many jurisdictions also give this right to misdemeanors, but we have found throughout the state, oftentimes someone charged with a misdemeanor shoplifting, misdemeanor larceny, a simple assault, if they have a bond that's $500, $1,000, they may be sitting in jail for 30 days or more waiting for the officer's next court date. So to address these racial inequities, it's our recommendation that there should be a first appearance for anyone who is not able to make bond and needs to go before the judge with court-appointed attorney. The third is related to it, that all who remain in custody shall be represented by counsel at the first appearance. And the representation should be provided by the state expense unless the person opts out to get their own privately retained counsel, or if they simply decide, I will waive my right to an attorney. And arrangements must be made for the counsel to meet with their clients prior to the first appearance to give adequate representation and have the individual's criminal history record in advance of that first appearance. The fourth recommendation that we unanimously agreed upon, legislation providing a sunset provision for all local ordinance crimes and establishing strict guidelines, limiting the ability of local governments to create new ordinance crimes, particularly those crimes that criminalize poverty and homelessness. So it's looking at our city ordinances. The fifth recommendation, Working Group 3, direct the Administrative Office of the Courts to update the 2019 tally report with racial data and to provide that information in subsequent tally reports. So within ACES, racial data is contained, but when the tally report comes out, the bandwidth of the information within ACES does not include that racial data. So we think it's critically important, the work of this task force, to have this information reported. The sixth recommendation is direct law enforcement to issue citations in lieu of arrest whenever possible for the highest charged misdemeanor incidents. Seventh recommendation, encourage law enforcement and prosecutors to use diversion practices in lieu of criminal charges whenever possible. That these diversion programs should be of no cost to those who are indigent. And DA Woodall talked about Orange County. In Durham County, we have misdemeanor diversion programs that officers divert instead of making that first criminal arrest, which is a criminal record, divert them to a program. And if they are in compliance, no charges will be filed. And the next recommendation is to study and make recommendations regarding reclassification of Class 3 misdemeanors and misdemeanor traffic offenses that do not adversely impact safety as non-criminal infractions. Some examples of these are expired registration, window tinting, no liability insurance, a first-time no operator's license, urinating in public. So some of these very low level, what are criminal charges, to become infractions or reclassify them in some other way. And the task force supports the Attorney General's overcriminalization project headed by Amisha Cooper. So I would like to invite anyone on our working group to please weigh in, to give any additions, corrections, or thoughts on these, and then open it up.
Representative Moore, thank you so much for sharing those recommendations with our wonderful task force. Again, folks, this is Mujtaba Muhammad serving you in the North Carolina Senate. I mean, the first recommendation as far as providing ethical standards and support for prosecutors is absolutely critical, I believe. Prosecutors do serve as our gatekeepers, and we've talked about this in our work group. And when you're doing this type of heavy work, burdensome work, sometimes folks can forget their ethical obligations, their duties, and their standards. So making sure we have standard rules and practices in a solid type training, similar to what we will recommend for racial equity training for our courtroom stakeholders like public defenders, judges, and DAs. Those are absolutely critical issues. And again, we've got to figure out better ways. Representative Maury went through so many wonderful recommendations. We'll see when we actually vote on some of those, but looking at ways to reduce a lot of these criminal charges through diversions and giving folks second chances and second opportunities instead of more and more oppression each and every day. There's a great way prosecutors and law enforcement can contribute to reducing the burden on our criminal justice system and making sure folks are much more productive as part of members of our community. So support a number of these recommendations and looking forward to continuing this work. So thank you, Representative Maury, for your leadership.
Thank you, Senator.
This is Ronnie Smith, County Commissioner here in Martin County, also the president of North Carolina Association of County Commissioners. One thing that I want to comment on, and first of all, I want to thank my group. We have a great group. There's some great discussion, but also some great issues, very important issues. My concern, one of the many concerns, is the local ordinance crimes. What I found in local government, the counties, as well as mostly cities, they have these ordinances that have been on the books for many, many years. And whenever they find times that they can use one of these ordinances, they pull it out. And I found that sometimes that can be racial bias when they decide to pull these ordinances out. And a lot of them, pretty much they inherit these, some of these ordinances, and sometimes they just go to the next door neighbor and find out what's going on and just copy that, and not knowing really what the end roots of what that could actually lead to. So actually looking at a sunset on these local ordinance and starting all over, and plus having some type of strict guidelines to deal with them, will make a big difference in how these local government ordinances are put in place and as well as enforced. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. DA Woodall.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to thank Marcia for her leadership on our working group and all the other members for all the work we've done. I think there'll be a couple of recommendations we vote on today, but all the recommendations we've talked about, I think one of the most important is misdemeanor first appearances. I think that's something that would have an immediate effect across the state, and it would help prevent a lot of injustices. So I would just like to point that out to everyone on the task force as one of the most important recommendations we have. But I thought Marcia's overview was excellent.
Thank you. And Tara Callahan?
Hey, I don't have a whole lot to add. You did an excellent job with delivering all of our recommendations, and really appreciate your leadership and the thoughtfulness of the task force and the presentations. I think the racial data available in the tally report really will help inform what the system actually looks like, who is actually being charged. So I think that's a really important element for to be accessible to school, government, and other folks looking into this.
Thank you. Karen?
All right then. Thank you, Representative Maury. So let's, why don't we just go ahead and start with those two recommendations. So I think you've got the information before, but I'll read them again. The first one, direct the administrative office of the courts to update the 2019 tally report with racial data and to provide that information in subsequent tally reports. And then the second one, recommend that all court personnel be required to undergo continued robust racial equity as a matter of state employment. Training topics should include structural racism, implicit bias, and cultural awareness. Training programs should be allowed for periodic updates or refreshers. So what we're looking for is we're looking for consensus of this so that we can just move on to a vote. So I want to open it up. Are there any other questions or for the Representative Maury or anybody else in the work group number 3?
Hello, this is Secretary Hooks. I just want to get a little bit of clarity on how the recommendations move forward, recognizing that the task force was pulled together to make recommendations to the governor. These are in AOC under the purview of the Madam Justice. And so when we say direct, just trying to make sure that we figure that out. We do have separations of powers. We have, those issues. So I just want to make sure that we get some clarity in how it's the final or written up product is.
I'll take a first stab at that, Secretary. I think that our task is to come up with as many ideas as we need to make it better, regardless of who implements it. So I think the use of force policy is an interesting one. The one that we did initially about ban on chokeholds, we made a recommendation to all law enforcement agencies across North Carolina to adopt a use of force policy that bans chokeholds similar to the one that your department has. But I could also see our task force actually making a recommendation to the legislature to mandate that all law enforcement agencies do that. So as it relates to this recommendation as to the AOC, it is directed to the AOC because they're the ones who keep it. But I think that maybe, that verb direct may be too much because we cannot direct them to do it, but our recommendation is that they do it, that the AOC update the report. Actually, Representative Murray, would you mind a slight tweaking of the language? So, because in our use of force one, it was encourage law enforcement agencies to change their policy, as opposed, because to the Secretary's point, we're not actually directing them to do it.
I think that's very prudent, and thank you, Secretary Hooks, for saying that. We could change the one word direct to request the Administrative Office of the Courts to update the tally report.
Any other questions, feedback? Well, hearing none, gonna call for is what we've done before, call for consensus. Do we have consensus on these two recommendations?
Maybe, should we do them one at a time and take a vote on each one?
Okay, why don't I do that? And then I'm gonna turn it over to Attorney General Stein for the actual voting, but just wanted to make sure. So let's go ahead and see if we have consensus on the first one around the tally report. Is there consensus?
No objections.
All right. One more time, any questions about? We have consensus, so it sounds like we have consensus on the first one. And then on the second one about recommending all court personnel be required to undergo continuing racial equity training. Do we have consensus? Call for consensus a second time. And calling for a consensus a third time. I'd like to turn this over. Attorney General Stein, would you go ahead and conduct the vote?
Absolutely. Thank you, Workgroup 3. Before we do the vote, I just want one brief comment. I want to apologize to Working Group 3. They were faster than we as task force leadership and staff could work. And so they came up with all these recommendations on Wednesday, but we wanted to have them in a form like what you just saw, according to a template that was digestible, and give you all time to review them before we had the discussion and ultimately this vote we're about to have. And so apologies to Work Group 3 for not being able to keep up with your pace, and we will do better going forward. To that, on the first recommendation concerning the AOC, is there a motion in favor of this recommendation?
I so move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any objection? All right, that one passes. The second recommendation concerning training of all court personnel. Any motions?
So moved.
Seconds?
Second.
Wonderful.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Working Group 3.
All righty then. So what we'd like to do is there were several other recommendations that that we're not going to bring to vote today, but we still want to discuss. And you heard those from Representative Maury. So I'm just going to again open it up for any questions or concerns or feedback. We have time for discussion. So I'll open up the floor or open up the room.
This is John Ledney. I had a question about the recommendation related to the ability of cities to pass local ordinances. I think what I heard was cities could not pass ordinances with a criminal penalty, but I wanted to clarify under that proposed recommendation, would cities still be able to enact local ordinances at the infraction level or things that would be at a different level? And I know there was a discussion about not related to poverty or homelessness and so on, but in general, other ordinances.
Yes, and Tim Woodall, would you like to take that since that was your recommendation?
Yeah, what we're proposing is that there be a sunset provision, so a time in the future when all local municipal county ordinances are null and void, but in the interim, a municipality or county could pass ordinances, but they would have to do that under more specific guidelines. So they could still pass ordinances, but the idea is to kind of sweep away and clean out all these old ordinances, some which really are no longer relevant to the society we are living in, and then give them stricter guidelines so we reduce the number of local ordinances and the things that we have on the book are relevant to the function that they want to see achieved.
I see. I can imagine if most councils and commissions are like the ones I've dealt with over the years, they want the ability to address issues of local concern. That could be, for example, noise ordinances. It could be things related to businesses. It could be other restrictions on city streets, so on and so forth. So as long as that ability is in there, I think that's will be sought after by those elected officials. And a related question to that, a year or so ago, the legislature directed municipalities to do an inventory of all their city ordinances and compile that, and then it went back to the legislature. Has there been work done on that directive? And is anything from that been worked on or part of your working group research?
It was actually. Jessie Smith from the School of Government talked a little bit about that. And I think she said one of the difficulties has been that the reporting municipalities and counties were often not very familiar with their own ordinances. And
really?
For example, she said many reported that they didn't have any when in fact they did. So I think that has been a struggle. That mandate has not been fulfilled, and it's been a struggle. But I think there has been legislation introduced a few years ago that's very similar to our recommendation. But to specifically answer your question, she indicated that had not come to fruition.
Okay, very good, thank you.
And I will add, we did pass in the House the criminal law reform bill. It was bipartisan. Dennis Riddell, Republican, and I co-sponsored it. And Chief, it was to make sure there was the reporting by the local municipalities to the state.
Yeah.
There was not compliance with everyone. So it was not completed, but we're still looking to that to get those reports in. Jesse reported there are over 11,000 local ordinances in North Carolina. And Jim brought up a good example during our working group. What was it?
No, but in Orange County, there is still an ordinance on the books that if someone accidentally kills a vertebrate, anything, a squirrel, anything with a vertebra, it has to be reported to the county. And our little joke is we don't know who it's supposed to be reported to. So we always have one ADA appointed to be the person who accepts those notifications when they come in. The phones are just burning up all the time with those notifications.
Well, I think in trying to comply with that regulation from a year or so ago, I thought it was a good exercise for us anyway to go through our code of ordinances and really look for things like that may have made sense decades, generations ago, but no longer do, and to clean those out, or at least make an inventory so we knew what we could recommend to our council to take off the books or enhance or whatever. And we did find some things that were very interesting, and not quite that interesting, but it was a very good exercise. And it's unfortunate that all municipalities didn't take advantage of that opportunity to find those things and clean them out so that we have reasonable, responsive regulations that actually have meaning.
This is Secretary Hooks. I would also like to add, Mr. District Attorney and Representative Moray, of course, you all are in a position to do it far greater than I can as a layperson, but I do fully support the review of all of the old ordinances because there are probably dozens upon dozens that need to be swept out. But when the final recommendation comes, particularly if there's discussions about local ordinances not carrying the weight of any criminal penalties, that you first examine that up under the Emergency Management Act too, because there could be some instances for states of emergency that you need the enforcement mechanism in place. And so I would just ask if you all would look at that with your legal backgrounds and eyes.
Thank you. Yes. And I might add that part of the discussion, even though it seems like a minor issue, it has great weight. Many people who are approached by law enforcement may be approached because of local ordinances, and things can get out of hand and can escalate, as we've seen what's happened nationwide. So I think this is an important recommendation. The other one that I will echo what District Attorney Woodall said, the first appearances, and to have people being held in our local jails for weeks, the collateral consequences are losing jobs, losing homes, losing benefits, and that anyone who's deprived of liberty because of a amount of money they cannot pay to be released, we need to get them in to a judge with an attorney to make sure we're not unduly depriving them of liberty and everything that follows. So the longer we delay, the more this keeps happening. So I hope that does go to a top priority for the task force to consider, and we will get more of the justification and statement of issue. And we need that tally report to show the racial disparity, how it does impact our minority people. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate our working group and the facilitators and our staff.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Representative Maury, and thank you very much to Working Group 3. So what I'd like to do right now is go ahead and turn this over to our last working group for the day, Working Group 4, and our chairperson, Henderson Hill.
Good afternoon to all members of the task force and our co-chairs, Justice Earls and Attorney General Stein. It's been my pleasure to work with Working Group 4. We have an amazing team, including Judge Thornburg, Judge Locklear Clark, Mary Pollard, and Commissioner Hawkins. And we've had 4 meetings, formal meetings, and untold number of hours in between meetings, committed by the members and by the incredible staff lead, Mercedes Restuka Clem. And I'm sure I butchered Mercedes' name, but they're all so beautiful. I left out Amalia. But Mercedes and the staff have been incredibly helpful in terms of stretching and extending our resources. We've been charged with 6 categories. And you'll see the breadth of these categories just by the names. The first being criminal trials, the use and impact of fines and fees, the death penalty and sentencing disparities, 4, redress for long-term sentences and implementation of second look processes, 5, prison discipline, and 6, collateral consequences of convictions. Those are subjects that could easily overwhelm a task force looking at each individual subject. And it's been our task to narrow our focus into things that are digestible. And so on criminal trials, what we've given our focus to are racial equities and racial disparities in jury selection. We've been aided by recent decisions by the United States Supreme Court and Mississippi versus Curtis Flowers, our own Supreme Court in State versus Cedric Hobbs, State versus Marcus Robinson, several other decisions just in the last year that have put the stamp on the historical legacy of discrimination as it affects the participation of African Americans on our jury. So the factual problem is not the issue. The struggle is how do we meet the challenges of eliminating this source of discrimination. And so our workforce is looking very closely at the experiences of our sister state in Washington and the very good model that they have promulgated to enhance the role of Batson as a test and as a means of excluding racial discrimination. We expect and have done, I think, impressive work in getting to the point of making recommendations. And Mercedes will lead us through a discussion of where we are on on some of the issues directed to jury disparities and also bias in the deliberative process. These are important barriers to racial equity in the performance of our courts. We've taken on the task of looking at racial disparities in terms of extreme sentences. And again, I can hear the voices of the coach of our members who are looking and asking us to focus on both the crafting of the problem and how we arrive at recommendations to address that. And I can hear other members asking and challenging where the data is. What is the quality of the data? One thing that becomes overwhelming is our need to recommend a research and data collection capacity that helps answers these questions of racial disparities across the board, including the 6 important issues that are given to our work group. But I'll say a word about the work going forward and the agenda that we've got for the working group. We've already started examining the racial disparities, and they are dramatic with respect to African Americans serving life sentences, life without parole sentences, virtual life sentence. And so the question is, how do we address that? And one helpful pointer is that the state has already spent some enormous resources looking at the impacts from the shift between fair sentencing to structured sentencing. There's data to inform these questions, and as we look to how to redress some of the clearly extreme sentences and things that we think are disproportionate and feed this sense of a lack of racial equity, we need to get our hands around those issues. And we've had some important discussion and presentation led by an expert from the Prisoners Legal Services. We expect to get more of that. We expect to get more helpful direction on how do we redress this. There are issues about reinstating or re-empowering the parole board and post-conviction supervision capacity. There's the Second Look Act, or the Second Look processes. In fact, there's a provision existing now in the motion of appropriate release statute. These are all available paths for redressing what we know to be a history of mass incarceration that dates at least 40 years back. Mass incarceration that was fueled by a war on poverty, a war on crime, and for many folks, a war on communities of color. How do we redress that? Well, we've got these different paths. Our charge as a working group is to see if we can make as direct a connection between the problem that we're attempting to solve and the solution to those problems. I think before I hand it over to Mercedes, I've been sort of whispering about the different strengths that our individual board members bring. Mike Hawkins, a accounting commissioner with a focus on data and the ability of that data to respond to the tough questions. Judge Thornburg, a word crafter and someone knowledgeable and experienced about how the interplay between fair sentencing and structured sentencing plays out. Judge Locklear Clark has been a leading force on the discussions about fines and fees and how we can bring that preliminary recommendation to another level. Can we examine the role of fines, court fines and fees in the goal of providing justice to the community? And Mary Pollard's executive experience in the public sector, sort of forcing us to match the goals with the path towards these recommendations. I think when Mercedes goes through the list of recommendations that we have vetted, that we've gotten to consensus on, I think and believe and trust that the task force will be appreciative of all the hard work that's gone into that And we invite the continued conversation on these proposals. As a working group, we will continue to refine and adjust both the recommendations and our statement of problems set to be corrected and our path to correcting those problems. With that, I wanted to make sure that Mercedes has enough time to go through the status of these very detailed recommendations. I know that she's prepared a PowerPoint that will help guide us through this discussion. And if there's time afterwards, perhaps we can hear from our working group or in response to questions by the task force. Mercedes?
Thank you, Henderson. Good afternoon, everybody. We're almost through. So I think Ellen's going to pull up the slides real quick. And as Henderson mentioned, we have been discussing two overall solutions that the work group has come to consensus on, and one of those being racial equity in juries, and the second of which is increasing funding for the governor's clemency office. So moving forward to the first solution that we've discussed, we're approaching these recommendations using the template that has been mentioned. So we are starting with a problem statement and then a value statement regarding a value-driven future goal, and then with some specific recommendations with some suggested steps for implementations. So the first, for racial equity in juries, our problem statement is, the exclusion and underrepresentation of African Americans specifically, and communities of color more generally, dates back to the shameful history of enslavement and is a response to Reconstruction. These continuing covert practices designed to underrepresent or exclude people of color from juries has seriously undermined the credibility and reliability of the criminal justice system, and there is an urgent need to eliminate this practice. The U.S. Supreme Court held in 1880 that the the Equal Protections Clause prohibits race-based exclusion from jury service. Yet we found that this prohibition has not been enforced, and it still remains today. Enforcement remains elusive today. When jury formation process is perceived as unfair, it undermines the democratic checks on states' power and the defendant's right to a fair trial, resulting in a loss of public trust in the prosecutorial function that may chill the future participation of marginalized groups. So with that being said, our future statement, our value-driven future statement, is one that is diverse juries that reflect the community ensure every sector of society participates in the administration of criminal justice. Implementation of recommendations will ensure jury pools reflect their communities, strengthen the Batson standard, prevent bias from influencing jury decision-making, and collect juror data to monitor racial disparities in North Carolina's jury system. So moving on, we broke those down into 4 recommendation areas. The first being a fair cross-section guarantee, the second, reviving Batson's promise, the third, addressing juror bias, and the fourth, better jury data, or improving jury data. So moving on to our first recommendation under fair cross-section guarantee. So let me talk really briefly. The fair cross-section requirement derives primarily from the 6th Amendment right to an impartial jury and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which generally prohibits systemic, intentional and unintentional exclusion of protected classes from the jury pool. And it also guarantees that a jury is drawn from a fair cross-section of the community. So with that being said, we had 4 recommendations under this area. The first being expand jury pool sources, with 2 ideas under that implementation, 2 implementation ideas under that recommendation being to amend section 9.2 to require the use of sources other than licensed drivers and registered voters, but also to include those that hold state identification cards, those that are receiving public assistance, those that are receiving unemployment, and tax filers and newly naturalized citizens. We'd also encourage county jury commissions to use those other sources. There's two options for implementation: encouraging the county jury commissions, knowing that the direction they are responsive to the county commissioners, right? Or going ahead and amending the statute, or both, frankly. So going on to recommendation 1.2 is updating the jury lists more frequently and correcting addresses to reduce undeliverable summons. And so in that respect, the implementation options are to amend 9-2 subsection B to require a master jury list that is prepared annually rather than every 2 years. Again, encouraging jury commissions to prepare master jury lists annually as opposed to every 2 years. And then third, using their authority under section 9-2.A, encouraging senior regular resident superior judges to request that master jury pool list be updated annually. Right now, the requirement is that they only be updated every 2 years, but superior court judges do have that authority to request that it be done annually. So going on to the third recommendation under this section, we will be talking about including race data on jury lists to monitor compliance with the fair cross-section guarantee. And that would be specifically be amending North Carolina General Statute 20-43.4 subsection B to require that the list provided to the county commission by the DMV commissioner includes race data. The fourth recommendation under this subsection is to ensure transparency at every stage of the juror formation process, including those in which private software companies is involved. There's been a lot of issues around the country regarding software being used. So making sure that the general statute related to this explicitly requires that counties utilizing these softwares maintain jury lists, and that there's immediate access to the raw data regarding list maintenance for analysis by clerks of court, jury commissions, and also the public.
Mercedes, let me stop you and ask whether or not these drafts were distributed to the task force members in advance of the meeting.
Not yet. I believe the only ones that were distributed in advance are the ones that are voted on today, but we can and will share these after.
So the PowerPoint will be shared.
Yes, yes.
I would encourage you to go to the jury bias recommendations, hit them quickly, and then the recommendation with respect to the clemency office, hit those quickly, and to reserve as many minutes as we can for members of the working group to add to the discussion as well as invite questions. Thank you.
Sure. I was just about to break to ask for questions. Regarding this last one, there's a recommendation of making sure that jury lists are available to the public, but we were just about to open it up to discussion about that, but we can move forward if you'd like and push through, or we can open it up to discussion now about those 4 specific recommendations. If anybody, okay, I will continue on then. Very briefly, reviving the Batson promise has to do with, we were talking about adopting a general rule similar to Washington State, Rule 37, that has to do with ensuring that prosecutors don't use their peremptory challenges to strike jurors based on race. The second recommendation was to require a state rule to require self-identification of race during jury voir dire and complete recordation of the jury selection process. The third under that was regarding training, was actually to require a state bar rule that for attorneys requiring 1 hour mandatory CLE every 3 years regarding implicit bias. The fourth, so we can keep going here. Addressing juror bias, we have the recommendation of encouraging clerks to show a jury video regarding implicit bias. publishing pattern jury instructions and encouraging the use of juror pledge. Also a state rule requiring attorneys to participate in legal education on exploring the use of bias during the voir dire process. Similar 3.3 is proper education for attorneys and judges on the use and the reference of race at trial. So going on to our last recommendation under racial equity in juries is improving jury data, and that would be developing a mandatory and transparent jury collection process regarding who is receiving summons, who's being excused and deferred, who's being challenged for clause, struck, or seated on the jury, and requiring that be available as public record with the exception of personal identifying information. The second being establishing a state commission on the jury system, a standing state commission on the jury system with an eye towards comprehensive reforms. We have a fairly antiquated system, so looking at data collection, jury list formation, and more importantly, how removals occur, race, bias, and equity, and then peremptory strikes and accessibility of juror pool software. So quickly, if we want to open up some discussion now talking about the jury selection recommendations before we move on to the clemency recommendations.
Thanks, Mercedes. Does anyone from the working group, would anyone like to add anything before we open it up for folks from the task force to give their feedback, questions, concerns?
All right, well, I can continue on with the recommendation regarding clemency, increased funding for clemency office. Ultimately, this was a recommendation that came from one of our members, Mary Pollard, regarding our problem statement being the growth of prisons and the expansion of the criminal code and policy agencies are all a direct legacy, again, of the shameful period of enslavement and our response to Reconstruction. We saw lots of data that had to do with as Henderson mentioned, the individuals that are serving long-term sentences. And so I won't take the time to read this here, but this is our problem statement, noting that at the very end, people serving life with parole sentences who are charged as children make up a startling 79% of people of color in our system. And so let's move on to, I guess our value-oriented future statement is the demographics of the state's incarcerated population should be representative of the demographics of the community. People who are currently incarcerated have a meaningful opportunity for an individual review of their sentence to determine if they would be eligible for parole. The recommendation specifically is to immediately add personnel to revamp the operations of the Governor's Clemency Office to work with DPS and the Parole Commission in order to give emergency attention to applications for clemency and commutation in 2 areas. Incarcerated persons at risk of COVID-19, including pregnant women, and parole eligible incarcerated persons who would have been released years ago if they had been structured under, if they'd been sentenced under the Structured Sentencing Act. The second recommendation is to implement a rebuttable presumption of immediate release for parole eligible incarcerated persons who would have been released had they been prosecuted under structured sentencing. And again, I would probably defer to Henderson or to Mary to lead the discussion on the second recommendation.
Well, I want to give Mary the first opportunity. I do have an overall comment on the entire slate of proposals, but Mary?
Well, on the increased funding for the clemency office and for the parole commission, we do have a significant class of parole eligible persons who were sentenced prior to 1994, and they're periodically reviewed and assessed for whether they can be released into the community safely. But the reality is that the operations of our parole commission are seriously underfunded. And the organization I was formerly with engaged in litigation several years back that related to the adequacy of parole proceedings for juveniles. And we learned just how overworked and underfunded the Parole Commission and its staff are, to the extent that they were making, I believe, an average of 90 decisions a day on various issues that came before them: post-release revocations, DWI cases, and the occasional parole case. So there's never been, I don't think, an adequate opportunity for them to really consider and assess and make informed decisions about releasing folks who, after all, were sentenced at a time when they had the promise of being able to be paroled if their behavior conformed while they were incarcerated. So they just need more ability to do their work. On the clemency office, the idea here is that, you know, there's and this is particularly in light of the COVID epidemic, the Department of Public Safety has I guess it's a early medical release program, but it's kind of limited in scope as to which people can be considered for release. So you might have a person who's really within months of release, but because of the nature of their conviction or the timing of their conviction, they're not eligible for the department's program. The governor has historically and constitutionally holds the power to review and assess these cases individually. And if his clemency office had adequate staffing and adequate resources, they could work with the Department of Public Safety to make these evaluations and make recommendations for commutations in cases where folks really are at risk in prison and could be safely released to the community, perhaps under some form of continuing supervision. So it's really a recommendation that helps both of these, the clemency and the parole commission. It's a recommendation that helps existing structures to be able to work better and to their fullest capacity and the way they were really designed to work in the first place. So.
Our hope is to use the next 30 days before the next meeting of the task force to refine and get some response from this group, but to refine these recommendations, tighten up some of the problem-solving statements, and prepare language, craft language on the recommendations. With respect to the clemency office, that sort of nudges into a larger set of issues that we will be speaking to. So in the first 30 days, it might, the recommendation might well be limited to addressing those emergent situations, those prisoners impacted by COVID-19, those where the gap between the two sentencing schemes have created a pool of folks with extremely long sentences, where we think that the governor's clemency office might have the capacity to deal with that. But our ambition is to use the next 6 weeks to start addressing some of the other items that have been assigned to us. And those are some very meaty items, and we'll have a work agenda schedule that will be, I believe, added to what's being distributed shortly, but it sets out a pace so that we can start to address the collateral consequences issue, the death penalty, and the Second Look Act, all of which have been the source of tremendous study and by academic sources, by the courts. And part of what we're wrestling with is how to most responsibly assess and address the challenges that rich body of learning provides, so that the recommendations we make are well informed and appropriate for the task force.
Henderson, since we have such a broad section talent here, I'd like to hear from folks that are on the broader task force about their thoughts on whether the clemency office expansion is way to go, or perhaps expanding the capacity of the parole commission or DPS to deal with some of these. Of course, it's the two issues. One's the immediate COVID issue, and the other is this group that were caught under fair sentence and that need to be addressed. So there's several ways to go, and I think the authority is overlapping in some cases. I'd like to hear maybe from some other folks on the task force with their recommendations or thoughts. We got a lot of collective wisdom and institutional wisdom.
Thank you. This is Secretary Hooks. I'll chime in a little bit. I wouldn't dare speak for the governor. He's also has his own counsel, as well as for me sitting on the cabinet, and then legal advice from the Attorney General as well to move forward concerning issues concerning what qualifies for clemency and how they look at that. But as a general concept, having resources to address these issues are vitally important. That could be the clemency offices. I agree, because DPS provides staffing support for the parole commission. So any movement forward with that to help them review cases and really be able to take a look at, we welcome those conversations. We welcome those appropriations and those actions as well. And I would say, as a whether you consider it self-serving or a value statement from the Secretary of the Department of Public Safety, that we look and would welcome any tools to enhance returning individuals to their communities safely. The Department of Public Safety, and certainly not Eric Hooks, is not maintaining people in an incarcerated status because we want to house them. We are holding them per judicial court orders and following the law in that regard. And so those mechanisms from a broader prospect, particularly where it impacts things from fair sentencing to structured sentencing, those are legitimate struggles that need to be worked out because they can create those larger disparities out there. But I just want to say for the record that that the proper programming while people are incarcerated, the transition to communities is ultra important. It's good for those individuals who've had contact with the criminal justice system. It's ultimately good for the communities and public safety. And quite frankly, it's good for our staff, who's been stretched thin by having to house so many individuals in our state system. And so we look for those legitimate mechanisms that move us forward in that regard. But I'm also mindful that authorities are limited and that people are incarcerated under judicial orders.
And it's important to note that we have an aging prison population, and that this group that particularly under fair sentencing, as they get old, is going to be a significant cost to the taxpayer to take care of these folks. And I know I don't have to tell you that, you're seeing it already.
And I'd just like to add, because I've worked with some of them in the past, that I do have a lot of confidence in the ability of corrections professionals, when they're given the resources to do their jobs properly, to make these evaluations and these recommendations. But they need the resources to do their jobs properly, and people can be safely released and should be. There's too many in who could go home and haven't been given the opportunity because of our lack of ability to pay adequate attention, I think, up until now.
First, let me say apologize for being late. Work kind of had me tied up a little bit, but I want to just chime in real quick. I think I agree with the Secretary Hooks. If we've got someone in prison, number one, who doesn't belong there, that should be our number one priority. And I think that the clemency office is the way to handle that. And I think the priority should be given to that. If we can identify folks who aren't going to be in a higher risk category and can release them from prison, we need to do that. We need to focus on it as much as we can. The other stuff is just as important, but I think the clemency route would, from my understanding, would be probably the priority, if that helps.
I find that comment very, very helpful. I do want to say that our working group has yet to have formal discussion about second look processes. So I don't want to get ahead of our own working group effort. But one of the issues that the Second Look Act suggests is that the trial courts, the county prosecutors, and local stakeholders are in a better position often to take a look at a sentence 15 or 20 years later and see whether or not that sentence is still the appropriate sentence. And this is a different resource than what's currently available through the parole system. And one of the questions that we'll be dealing with is whether that is a feature that our system needs. The current MAR statute has a provision under 1420E, which suggests that the district attorney, the local superior court judge, and defense counsel can reach agreement on the appropriateness of a particular sentence. How that should be, how that should fit in the constellation of tools available to redress extreme sentences is something our working group will take a first crack at. But the complexities of this issues may tax us as a working group. I anticipate that on an issue such as the MAR statute, Judge Thornburg, myself, and someone from the School of Government may be tasked to have offline conversations and bring that back to the working group to suggest whether this is something that we can go forward with under our time limits. And the sort of similar discussions may be online with members of the parole board and Mary Pollard to see whether some of these conversations are things that the working group can responsibly handle at the working group level, and whether or not those offline conversations will assist and facilitate the efforts of the working group. So I think we've taken on a lot to chew. We've got an ambitious work schedule ahead of us. The working group has been willing to put extraordinary time into these efforts, and we look forward to coming back to the task force with clarification and refinements of these proposals.
Can I just raise one question related proposals that suggest increasing funding? Wondering if we have the capacity to do to gather the kind of data on what how much money might, if the recommendation is implemented versus how much the recommendation might cost. I mean, I know there are that's a whole area of expertise of analyzing the costs of various policies, but it just seems to me that could be useful information.
Justice Charles, we do have somebody looking into that specific question. They just weren't able to come up with the answer in time for today's presentation.
Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you.
So we have a few more minutes. If folks have any other thoughts or questions or feedback for Working Group 4 as they continue working towards recommendations.
I think it was mentioned from Justice Earle's comments about the listening session or the public session, that there's been input about from victims and victim families. I think as we as a working group head towards second look processes and death penalty conversations, the role of victim families and victims is something that has to be anticipated. And it's part of a larger conversation about restorative justice and the approach to violent crime and the meaning of punishment. These are some extraordinarily large questions, but clearly there are insights from that particular stakeholder group that needs to inform some of the recommendations and the deliberations of the working group. And one of the things that we anticipate in the work schedule ahead is to have some of those views inform the deliberations at the working group level.
This is Kerwin Pittman here. Just listening, I think it is extremely important that we alleviate some of the stressors on the parole commissions for them to be making typically those amount of decisions on a day-to-day basis is extremely unacceptable. And we as a task force have to do something to kind of alleviate that issue, because we know the more decisions they make, the more tired the brain seems to get. And so more overlaps for mistakes by not looking at things with a thorough eye. As well as we should look into the clemency office, as well as we should, I feel it is strongly that we should right the wrongs of the past. And so for immediate looking into is individuals who are able to be released and qualified to be given a MAP or be put on the MAP program. I'm a strong proponent of utilizing this, and being someone who is formally justice involved, I know that the utilization of the MAP program is far few and in between and needs to be utilized more. And so I think this should be one of the main focuses as of right now, as well as the COVID pandemic that is still going on, that I'm receiving calls daily from individuals involved in the criminal justice system.
Thank you for that. And it's entirely something that should inform these discussions and inform the recommendations that we come back with.
I just take a second to second what Henderson said earlier about thanking the staff, because you know, we've had these working group meetings and we've talked about these ideas, and all of a sudden they're all fleshed out with so much information and statutory references and other resources we can look at and read. It's been a lot to keep up with, but it's been great. And I imagine that's been true for all the work groups. So just thank you.
Mike, did I see your hand? Hawkins?
Yeah, Henderson, I just wanted to echo what Mary just said. It's been a lot of information and a lot of, it's almost a fire hose kind of thing, but it's I don't know what the right word is. It's inspiring to be able to work with people who are trying to do things like this and do it in the right way. And I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate your leadership, Henderson.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts before we turn it back over to Justice Earls and AG Stein? All right, just a reminder that, oh, go ahead.
Excuse me. Yes, just a quick thought that I had. I know it might be off center of the current topic, but I don't know if I'll be given an opportunity, so I wanted to address it. With the particular working groups, is it possible for other individuals on different working groups to attend these working groups as attendants to just kind of weigh in? Because I don't know if I've seen a schedule for the particular working groups, and so I'm having to follow up via YouTube. And so I want to know if it's possible for individuals from other working groups to just attend these individuals working groups as maybe attendants or something, just so we can kind of see what's going on in real time.
Absolutely. That's a great idea. Yeah, anybody who wants to attend any other meeting, feel free. And the way I look, Anita and I had a conversation about this at the beginning, and Anita, if I get it wrong, just corral me. But my view is that the working group obviously has primacy because they're the ones who've been spending all the time on it. But if another task force member is attending a working group member and everyone else sort of weighed in, I think it's fine for you to chip in and ask a question too. Anita, does that work for you?
Yes, and in fact, that has happened. So other task forces, I'm aware of at least one other person who's been attending their meetings and they're on the screen, they can participate. I think, Kerwin, though, part of your question was, how do you find out in advance when those meetings are scheduled, whether you can attend?
And we can fix that. We will make sure everybody knows about every working group member, and people can choose as their schedule permits and go from there.
And I'll just jump in there to say, we'll follow up with an email with these instructions, but in your member SharePoint, there is a calendar that has a rolling list of all of the meetings. We sent out that PDF, but obviously there have been some updates and additional meetings added since then. So we'll get you that information.
If I can build upon that, it would be helpful to have the agenda to the extent that's published ahead of time, so we know what the topics are going to be and what meeting we may want to attend as a result.
Good point.
All right. Well, Thank you, folks. I'll turn it back over to Attorney General Stein and Justice Earls. Thank you.
Justice Earls, final word.
Yes, this has been really fantastic. And just want to make sure everyone's aware that our next public hearing is a week from yesterday, so September 3rd, Thursday evening, 7 p.m. This is the only evening public hearing. Time I looked at this, I think half the slots were filled, but there were still empty slots. I think we will hear, there were some that we had already, but I would also encourage you, particularly if you have networks that include people who would not be because they work during the day, if you could help us spread the word about the public hearing so that people feel like they had the opportunity to participate, and easy.
Justice Searles, I think you froze from our end. All right, you're back.
Okay, sorry.
We heard you say spread the word to networks that may not have otherwise heard about it and who work during the day.
Right, and so I was hoping that we could get the link sent around so everyone can easily do that. And I was just gonna, urge that the broader participation we have, the better off we'll be. Again, thank you all, and we'll just continue moving forward.
Thank you, Justice Earls. Now I think you all appreciate the excitement Anita and I had coming into this meeting, because now you've heard and seen how much thought, both the breadth and depth of thought that each working group has been doing. And so we're really appreciative of everyone's hard work. I want to thank Mary for recognizing the staff, because my goodness, there are so many people who are working so many hours to make sure we are making progress. And so I want to echo my deep appreciation for all the people, all the staff folks who are working hard to keep us on task. And Tally asked us to create time. We wish we had the power to do so, but I think we will take the spirit in which that was offered, which is we want to come up with ways to make sure that you all have as much time, opportunity to deliberate and make recommendations to the full task force. Because that just demonstrates how seriously you all are taking this task and want us to make real progress, and something that we all share. So appreciate everyone's time and attention today, and look forward to the public hearing next and ongoing working group meetings over the next 4 to 5 weeks. Thanks.